Hello and welcome, friends. Today we look at reporting and writing on women's issues. This is the second in the series of writing for target groups and special interest audience. Part 1 of the series looked in detail at reporting and writing on environment, a topic of great contemporary significance. Both these topics are geared towards informing and educating a special or niche audience which is interested in following issues like violence against women as well as human trafficking and laws related to women's health and education. In our last program, we have already fleshed out a scenario explaining how mainstream news is playing catch up with reader and audience demands for news pertaining to development, climate change, gender issues, and other such niche topics. This niche or special audience, reader and listener, is not just content with the regular dose of politics and entertainment dished out in mainstream media, but wants to know much more about what is happening around him or her. So, as a reporter on the special beat tracking women's issues, you will be catering to the select audience, tracking the less than mainstream topics related to development, rural issues, children and women's issues, and the environment. Sounds good? So let's begin. But before we do that, let me introduce our subject expert Shikha Gandhi, and I am Sakshi Mandwal. Today's program will talk and explain a diverse mix of topics related to reporting on women's issues, like skills required by a rookie journalist for covering women's issues, like selection of topics and giving breadth and depth to your reportage through proper research, covering violence against women in a sensitive and responsible manner, tips for interviewing survivors of abuse. At the completion of this program, you will be able to find and develop newsworthy story ideas on women's issues, be able to find and use sources, research women's issues, be able to report and write on violence against women, interview survivors of abuse, write a women-oriented story in a concise, in-depth and lucid manner. But before going any further, let's start with providing you a basic understanding about women's issues. Reporting on women's issues. An introduction. There is writing for women and writing about women. While the prevalent kinds of writing mostly focus on the 4 F's of traditional women's issues: food, furniture, passion and family, the most serious category, like writing about women, makes sense of women's experience and knowledge. It evaluates changes that have taken place in the status of women due to constitutional, legal and administrative measures, and traces the impact of social change on various sections of women and measures which help and enable women to take their rightful space in society. This kind of reportage is respectful of women even if they have been victims of abuse. As a serious journalist, you may pick up topics like feminizing of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, reproductive health, laws affecting women, security, employment and violence against them. The role of journalists covering the beat. Journalists and media have a vital role to play in increasing public understanding of women's issues. However, even well-intentioned reporting can sometimes perpetuate rather than help in solving problems that women face across the globe, like a 2009 study found that the media can subtly induce society to justify violence against women by focusing unduly on assumed reasons or causes for the violence. Media coverage can influence individuals' behaviors as well as their attitudes. For example, distorted coverage of domestic abuse and rape might encourage a woman who is living with a sexually abusive partner to stay put for fear of Beat essentials. Reporting techniques. A. Where is a woman-centric story? This beat, more than any other, demands going beyond the predictable. An idea for a woman-oriented story is not in books and research journals, but around us. While you may get a great story idea by watching news, reading a magazine, or just following trending topics on social media, but your best bet remains leaving the newsroom and visiting areas to get yourself. These are women's rescue, rape crisis and marriage counseling centers, family courts, fashion shows, kitty parties, women's compartment, schools or boardrooms, places where women work, travel or get together. You will be surprised what observation and simple talk can achieve. All you have to do is to be in the right place at the right time for that great story. While picking up a topic for a story, always look for a fresh angle and new voice. For example, if you were asked to do a story on surrogacy, it is the angle that will make all the difference to the impact of the final story. Let's take an example here. Which of the two stories is most likely to be liked by more readers? A story on the perils of surrogacy or a story on the impact of the new assisted reproduction technology bill? Most people would like to read or see a story that brings out something new about surrogacy to the forefront. Therefore, they are more likely to read the story on the new Assisted Reproduction Technology Act. After doing some research, you may want to narrow the story down to the question, what is the impact of the new act on unborn surrogate children? Remember, your audience would prefer a story that talks about the impact of the bill on people. A new angle and approach always helps in garnering an audience. Researching the story. Research for a woman-oriented story comes in 3 stages: seeing, defining, and illustrating. Seeing means getting the preliminary information to get a clear idea where the story is going. Defining means that issue or point which can become the focus of the story. And the third is illustrating, which means that you have to find the case histories, scenes, descriptions, anecdotes that support your main points. Once you have an idea and focus for your story in place, the next step is getting as much information on the topic as humanly possible. Research is an important requirement of writing for women. It is necessary to make sure of your facts and figures before you put them down on paper, because once printed, they become the gospel truth. In the 80s, there was a lot of writing and reporting on bride burning in magazines and newspapers. Many of these reports quoted how many brides were burned to death in one city in a year. Often the figures varied from 300 to 600 in Delhi alone. Clearly, this was an enormous variation, but no journalist worth his or her salt questioned this. This is an example of both irresponsible reporting and bad research. What happened was that journalists just picked up material from any available source. In order to carry out genuine research, it's best to approach relevant libraries like Center for Women's Studies, National Institute of Public Cooperation and Child Development, Departments of Women's Studies in colleges and university libraries, and Kali for Women. For researching crime against women, the place to visit is the National Crime Records Bureau. The NCRB publishes annual reports like Crime in India since 1953, which are of immense help for a journalist to track and report on crimes against women. As a journalist, you can use this data for compiling background information on, say, which cities and states are the most unsafe for women. The thing to do is to gather as much background information first from prior news reports and government documents and reports, and then narrow your research to a particular organization or resource person. Beware of researching too extensively on the internet and cross-check all facts before using them in your story. What are the other ways to research? Well, there are a number of women's groups, NGOs and organizations all over the country which are involved in campaigning and activism apart from primary research on women's issues like violence in families, rape, women's health and childcare, etc. Keep track of these institutes as well, because if you want to do a story on equal wages and safety of women in factories and on farms, You may find that there is no better place than the Society for Participatory Research in Asia, PRIA. Other things to do are writing to women's groups, join their websites, attend seminars, and discuss and participate in demonstrations to get insights and ideas for new stories as well as to research your story. Read the latest research journals, national and international, to expand your perspective. Identify and read reputable popular publications writing on women's themes. Make sure you know what's happening on your beat at any particular point of time. You should be knowledgeable on latest laws passed in the country that affect women's lives, like the anti-rape and domestic violence bills and others. This particularly applies for journalists in countries like ours, where women's issues generally go underreported, despite the fact that developing countries are most vulnerable to problems affecting women. Locating sources. Valuable sources are faculty of departments of women's studies in universities and colleges. Public information officers at colleges and universities, government agencies and foundations and institutes can help you get in touch with the change makers in the field. So, make sure you are in touch with them, and whenever you can, contact an expert via a PIO. Good PIOs can help steer you to the most articulate sources and sometimes even answer basic questions. Reporter's skill set. A. Good interviewing techniques. A good women's oriented story requires skill and empathy in asking questions. Remember, you are dealing with ordinary people and not newsmakers that are used to being interviewed. So, your job is to make the interview as close to an ordinary conversation as possible, just like a chat with a neighbor. A University of Nevada professor, LaRue Gilliland, has devised a simple pattern for asking questions that are uniquely suited to get anecdotes, specially needed for feature story that you may be researching for. He calls it GOSS, representing goals, obstacles, solutions, and start. Goals. What is the person or agency struggling to achieve? Obstacles. What stands in way of achievement? Solutions. What is being done or proposed to surmount the obstacles? Start. Understanding the beginning is often helpful in understanding fundamentals. Beginnings often make interesting anecdotal stories in themselves. Use this in order to be a more effective interviewer. Now it's time to move on to the important topic of reporting and writing on violence against women. But before we do that, let's relook at all that we've learned till now. We have learned skills for reporting on women's issues, finding a story, researching it, finding sources, interviewing techniques. One of the burning issues which affects women across the globe is violence, which can be sexual, physical, or emotional. So, let's take a closer look at this important and sensitive topic and understand ways in which you can report and write on it. Writing and reporting on violence against women. The media has a vital role to play in increasing public understanding of violence against women and challenging its place in our society. Right now, in the wake of the Nirbhaya episode, our country is coming to terms with the vulnerability of women and children to crime and abuse. Yet, a critical look at media's coverage of rape shows that most reportage and writing on violence against women is slanted in favor of the male. Even as we watch this program, we are being bombarded by images and articles about good mothers, wives, daughters, and sisters versus the bad women who wear revealing clothes to invite sexual assault from men who can't control their natural urges. You, as a journalist on the beat, have a big role to play in challenging and breaking a woman as well as men, because this only helps in women being treated as second-rate citizens and of the men being dubbed as monsters, brutes, or dumb animals, both dangerous from the point of any sane discourse on the issue. The first step to be a responsible journalist means avoiding sensationalization or coloring of news related to violence against women or war. We shall be discussing these issues later, but first things first. A great story on this sensitive issue starts with a journalist who knows where to look for it. Looking for a story. As a journalist, you must be mindful of the fact that countless people are affected by sexual violence in their communities and that there are many stories to tell here. So, you go to the community to find that great story. Your best bet is to focus on stories that explore community responses, explain the short or long-term health effects of victimization, or offer parents information about red flags that could signal abuse. Stories about prevention and how communities have come together to do the right thing are equally powerful. Now let's take a look at some of the questions a seasoned journalist on the beat asks to dig out good stories. What happens to a person who comes forward and reports sexual abuse? Who are the people in the community that assist victims? Where does most reported sexual violence occur in the community, and what are authorities doing to stop that? What measures are being taken to prevent sexual violence and educate the public? What has worked and what hasn't? Being accessible electronically helps as survivors of abuse can approach you about their experience. So, blog and have a strong social media presence. This will keep the ideas pouring in. Open a dialogue with a professional who is trained in dealing with sex abuse. Meet with the victim advocate in the country you are covering and use them as a bridge to communicate with victims and get interviews, says Sarah Ghanim, Pulitzer Prize winning reporter on locating stories on the beat. Sources, sources, sources. Seriously, what is a journalist without sources? So, how do you cultivate them? Meet people related to the beat and strike up conversations, face to face and electronically. This will help you cultivate your sources. Always look at diverse voices. Don't look for only sources from a single background and social strata. Mix them up. You could try and brainstorm story ideas with advocates against sexual violence and experts on the subject. These sources notice trends and have access to information that reporters don't generally have. You could also establish relationships with staff at a local rape crisis center and with prevention experts. These sources can add insight and context and provide codes for stories about sexual violence. Now that you have your story idea, we look at some of the ways in which you can flesh it out while making it interesting and factually correct. Where can you do your research? In any story of sexual violence, it can be helpful to include statistics that provide context, like how many rapes occur annually by people that are known to the victim? How many children are sexually abused before the age of 18? What percentage of sexual violence occurs in the workplace? Statistics help readers understand that how common sexual violence is and that it can happen to anyone and that it can be prevented. A number of organizations can provide statistics including the National Crime Records Bureau, the Sexual Violence Resource Center, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the Rape, Abuse and Incest National Network. Can also help if you are looking at an international angle. Interviewing survivors of abuse. A. Negotiate terms beforehand. Interviews with sexual violence survivors don't generally happen in one sitting. Many reporters talk with survivors multiple times. With difficult subjects like abuse and violence, it can be helpful to outline some of the areas you might want to discuss in order that a survivor can gather her thoughts beforehand and think about how to express her experience. Make the survivor comfortable. During the first interview, it's important to give the survivor plenty of time to share his or her story in whatever way feels most comfortable. So, don't push or rush. You should talk with the survivors about the interview process and answer any questions they raise pre-interview. Types of questions to ask. Fear of being blamed for their own abuse is a key reason that many survivors are unwilling to speak out. Avoid questioning why an assault occurred. This can be viewed as victim blaming or as suggesting that the victim somehow provoked the incident. The best questions are open-ended, non-judgmental questions. For example, instead of asking, "Why didn't you tell anyone about the abuse?" ask, "What barriers kept you from being able to tell anyone about the abuse?" Start slowly, asking basic questions about what happened, followed by the more difficult ones later. It can be difficult at first for survivors to share details. Give them enough space to tell their story in their own words. You could ask about their concerns and misgivings instead of looking like you are being judgmental. If needed, use gentle prompts. "And then what happened? What else?" Once the survivor recounts the incident, you may want to clarify the details in a subsequent interview. Also, make sure that you try to get specifics about anything that needs clarifying and also try to find other ways of corroborating the story. Ask, "Who else knows?" or "Where can I find that information?" or "Were there any other people in the area?" Last but not the least, always ask survivors how they want to be identified. Some women will want to be fully identified and others may like to keep their identity secret. Writing the story. The very first thing to determine is whether you have the focus of your story crystal clear before you even think of writing it down. If writing on the issue of surrogacy, ask yourself whether you have figured out what exactly you want to say. Is your story aiming to educate women on the new surrogacy bill and how it will affect the lives of professional surrogates, or is it a critique of the new bill? You should also have an idea about the total word count of the article, the subtopics, and how much space will you be giving to each one of them. And finally, what will follow what? Having said that, let's take a quick look at some important issues that you must keep in mind while writing on violence against women. Empathic language. You should carefully choose language, especially when reporting on violence against women, and always avoid implying the survivor is to blame. Portray perpetrators as real men and portray survivors of violence as real women. Avoiding myths and stereotypes. You should report on rape and sexual violence using data and evidence and avoid myths and stereotypes. Some common rape myths are that rape happens because men can't help it and that it happens only to bad women. Consider the images. You should ensure the images chosen do not distort your story on violence against women, contribute to the problem, or objectify women. Never show a crying woman or a disrobed woman as an image with a story on rape. Don't trivialize violence against women. You should treat violence against women as a serious concern and use an appropriate tone in all reporting. There should be no attempts to trivialize rape. While discussing the do's of reporting on violence against women, let's take a look at one example of objectionable reporting on rape. In a shocking case of gross irresponsibility, CNN cited boys from a football team in a small town called Steubenville in US who had raped a young girl, Jane Doe, while she was unconscious. The focus of CNN's program was on the destroyed lives of these boys who were caught on tape raping a girl, branding the verdict against the two rapists by the jury as a tragedy. Similarly, there are numerous mainstream articles covering issues on commercial sex work with no reference to its dangers or harms, especially in mainstream media. These kind of articles can serve to glamorize the sex industry. Articles which used funny headlines were articles talking about harassment, or those calling suspected perpetrators of abuse as decent men also increased crime against women. The best part about writing for women is that you can be agents of change and can make a lot of difference to numerous lives. Keep this in mind and grow as a serious reporter on the beat. Recap. In today's program, we have learned skills for reporting and writing on women's issues, finding sources and ideas for a story, researching and reporting, reporting on violence against women, interviewing survivors of abuse, writing a story about women's issues. In part 3 of Writing for Target Groups, Special Interest Audience, we shall be telling you more about writing and reporting on development. Till then, happy learning and goodbye.